While we're waiting for people to enter, we got about another 10-15 seconds. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. This is where we're going to house any wow or aha moments that you have during our session. We'll also be utilizing the question and answer space. So if you have any wonderings or what ifs, we're going to ask you to place those in there, and then we'll check those halfway through, and then we'll address the rest of them at the end of the session. So take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. As you're introducing yourself in the chat, we found with the webinar that the default menu wants us to go with our chat as all panelists. We're going to ask you to make a change. If you could, as you're typing in your chat, make sure that it's set for all panelists and attendees so everyone's voice is lifted in the space. Otherwise, it just goes to myself and my colleague, Colleen and Laura. So we want to invite you to change that setting so everyone can see your thoughts. So once again, make that change in the setting, then introduce yourself in the chat. I see a lot of people doing that right now. Thank you so much. And as you're introducing yourself in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Mary Lou Strimble. I'm a literacy consultant for Wayne Risa. I was in the classroom for 23 years as an educator, and I have experienced grades 5 through 8. I also have experience as a literacy coach, K through 6, and a reading interventionist, K through 2. And I have a passion for literacy. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Colleen, so she can introduce herself.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Mary Lou. Hi, everyone. We're happy to spend the Friday afternoon with you, learning a little bit about read-alouds in a remote setting. This is my 30th year in education. Wow, it's gone so fast. Most of my years have been in the classroom teaching, but the majority of these last few years have been consulting and coaching. So I'm happy to be here with you and do some learning alongside you.
We'd also like to introduce our colleague, Dr. Laura Gabrion. We're blessed to have her with us today. She is doing the back channel. So you may not see her face, but she is there, and she will be checking the Q&A box for us in the chat and dropping in the links as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. We'd like to offer this tool for your use if you find it helpful. It's a reflection guide, and Laura is right now dropping in the chat box this tiny URL. And if you find this helpful, go ahead and open it. It's going to prompt you to make a copy. And then you can use this to take notes about our session, or any of the links that we drop in the chat, you could copy and paste right in that document. If you find it helpful, please use it, access it, and use it. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our content. The one thing that we want to be mindful of, we know this at Wayne Risa, that no matter what our school year looks like this year, in 2020, 2021, we know that the literacy essentials are still the answer to the question we have about research-based instructional practices. So you'll know in our session today, you'll notice that we are leaning heavily into these essentials. Our outcomes for today. We are covering the essential instructional practices in early literacy K3 number 2 around interactive reading, interactive read-alouds. This is a complex and pretty weighty subject. So we're going to give you this caution. We might go a little bit over today. We are in the confines of an hour, and we want to give you a heads up that we could possibly go over because we have so much information to share with you today. And if that happens and you have to step out at 4 o'clock, please take care of your needs. And if you need to leave at that time, please do. But we wanted to give you a heads up. We might be going a little over today because we're so excited to share the information we have with you today. We are not only going to review the essential, we're also going to take a look at some thematic and conceptual related sets of texts and how to access that. And then we're going to go over print concepts, word recognition, and higher level questionings as instructional practices with interactive read-alouds. As always, we want to lean into these literacyessential.org. The document is, the K3 document is found on this website. In fact, Laura's going to drop in the chat the link. So we invite you, if you don't have the paper copy at your elbow, you might want to go and open the document and access Essential 2, so it's at your elbow as we work through our session. But we also want to remind you of the online modules. Online modules that are free resources and have the capability of allowing you to earn sketchies, and it has a wealth of information there, as well as videos and templates that you can use to strengthen your literacy instruction. Colleen and I have had the pleasure many times to be participant in Dr. Tanya Wright's sessions. And she wrote an article, The Power of Interactive Read-Alouds. And this quote really spoke to Colleen and I when we were thinking around our work in interactive read-alouds. And keeping at the forefront of our thinking that these practices for read-alouds have to be interactive. And this means that the teacher and students are actively involved in thinking and talking about the read-aloud text. So thinking around that quote and what the strong research tells us, we really wanted to start thinking about creating a situation where we could think through this essential from a remote environment. So let's start with the research. If you take a look at the bullets, we know that strong reading aloud should be taking place from birth and beyond. Sometimes we fall away from that, we get into the secondary level, but research shows that we should be reading aloud to our students right through high school. It is essential to learn reading and writing from read-alouds. I often said to my students, read like a writer and write like a reader. It is helpful in children learning word concepts that they're not independently ready for. We like to say we can't wait for children to decode fluently in order to build their knowledge of the world. We have to involve them in that knowledge before they are independently able to read it. And then they can use that knowledge to support their comprehension when they encounter new text. We also know that through explicit teaching, our students can walk away with solid strategies on word meanings and print concepts. Read-alouds are critical for literacy development when we think about reading, writing, but also listening and speaking. Read-alouds lend into all four of those areas of literacy development. And last but not least, the joy of read-alouds. Anytime you go into a classroom and a teacher announces, time for the read-aloud, the joy on the students' faces. So we want to make sure that we continue to read aloud to children, to involve them in the joy of reading. So that brings us to the question, what would this look like and sound like in a virtual environment? When we have our remote learning, what should this look like and sound like? Some suggestions: minimum of 1 read aloud a day. We would encourage more. Might you include a read aloud also with your science, social studies, or math curriculum? Make sure that it's purposeful and planned when you're selecting the text and you're setting your instructional goals. A reasonable length of time per the child's age. So consider, how long will a kindergartner sit in front of a screen as I read aloud or as I deliver that instructional goal? Don't forget to use a variety of texts, poems, songs, infographics. Many times with read-alouds, we lean into fiction, which is wonderful, but what about nonfiction? Again, connecting to those content areas. And then remember, a repeated reading of a text with multiple instructional goals gives you the biggest bang for your buck, and it helps with that time constraint. We know that we don't have that 6 hours face-to-face in this new reality for most of us. So using a text over and over again with multiple instructional goals helps with that time constraint. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. Colleen?
Thanks, Mary Lou. So as we continue to think about read-alouds, we're going to dive in closely and look at essential number 2, as Mary Lou mentioned earlier. And when we look at read-alouds, we need to consider, the bullets. We know that we can look at the read-alouds and think, oh yeah, I do read alouds. And then literally in our minds, we check off essential number 2 and we say, yep, we're good with that. But what we know is so much more. From the research, each essential is really chock full of many different nuances and instructional practices, and we need to consider those. So the first bullet under Read-Alouds is making sure that we have appropriate text for our children. And when we say appropriate text, we really are thinking about sets of text that we can read aloud across multiple sessions that are thematically or conceptually related. So it gives children an opportunity to learn from particular subject areas. Maybe they haven't had the opportunity or the access to certain books. And so if we're thinking about books that are offered in a thematical way or a conceptual way, we're giving multiple opportunities for children to read and learn and hear about different content areas. So it's really nice to be thinking about. You can easily see the graphics on the slide. If we're maybe considering a fairy tale and we just want to look at the 3 little pigs, think about how many different offerings of that same story. What a nice way for children to really grasp the concept and those story elements within that fairy tale. We can also consider to think about other ways of tackling nonfiction. Maybe we're nestling in on reading more about the oceans. How would we gather thematic units and gather read-alouds, text sets that we can share with children? They learn different information from the different texts, but they also are building their content knowledge and vocabulary as well. The next bullet talks about modeling. And we consider Read-Alouds as a really nice go-to, especially in the elementary classrooms. But what we need to remember is how important it is for our young children to know what reading sounds like. What does fluent reading sound like? What does reading with expression sound like? How does it sound when we use prosody in our wording? So all of these things are very important for kids to hear and be able to start to mimic what it sounds like to be a reader. When we consider our English learners, when we consider our students who are having some difficulty in reading or writing, it's very important that they have that read aloud as a model and they can hear that fluent reading again and again throughout the day. And as Mary Lou had mentioned, we do recommend a very minimum of 1 read aloud a day in a virtual setting. And we know if we were in a classroom with students, we'd be reading to them multiple times a day. So please consider a short poem, maybe a morning message, maybe a snippet from a nonfiction magazine title. All of these things are considered read-alouds, and we need to make sure that we're harnessing every avenue we can to offer those opportunities for our students. The next bullet really dives into that whole notion of taking a look at words within text and really diving into those words and thinking about the meaning of them. So often we hear students don't have the vocabulary. They're struggling in that area. They don't know what these words mean. And so we have to be very mindful and intentional about thinking about determining what words will be particularly noticed in this read aloud, and then not just to mention the word, not just to have the students repeat the word, not to just give them a child-friendly definition, but also give them some opportunity to interact within that word. So it's very nice to be thinking about a read aloud. We try to make it as smooth and poetic as possible. So we don't want to distract too much from the read aloud. So if you were reading a text with maybe a word like phenomenal, you might just pause for a moment and say, oh, that means really great. And then get right back into your reading. We don't want to take them off into a journey down another path and get them away from the story. We can just simply supply a nice child-friendly explanation of that word and move forward. The really nice thing about focusing on particular words is to be thinking about what we could do with them after, making sure that you're including movement and props, maybe photos, maybe doing word sorts with examples and non-examples. These are all really nice ways to encourage vocabulary and continue practice throughout the day and the week. Another bullet within a read aloud is really focusing in on that higher order discussion between the teacher and the children. And it happens before the reading begins, during the actual read aloud, and after as well. So be thinking in your mind as you consider these remote settings, what will discussion look like? How will you offer kids the opportunity to share their thinking and wondering? How will you have the opportunity to share with two children talking to one another and getting ideas from each other? Dive into those learning platforms and see the best ways that you can get children to be interacting. We don't want to just hear them talking all the time. In fact, Mary Lou and I laughed a little bit about doing this webinar because we always like to hear your voices as well. The last thing we want to do is be up in front of you and just talk at you. And so this is a nice reminder again that we want to make sure we're not just reading aloud and not offering opportunities for conversation with the kids. The next bullet really involves multiple aspects of instructional strategies. And so this first aspect would be the print concepts. So we're really considering certainly our very youngest readers when we think about print concepts, probably our kindergarten and first grade, or maybe even in second, third grade when a student is struggling or having some difficulty with actual conceptualizations of words. So what we consider here with print concepts is really offering the opportunity to show kids how words work on a page in a book, how words work on a page in a magazine, and how words work when we write and scribe the thinking that we have on a page as well. So having that opportunity to run your fingers alongside the print, showing directionality, also showing how we turn pages and how we move forward as we continue reading. Also, where might we lie our eyes when we first enter a page? All of these things seem so, seem that children would quickly understand them, but they need specific and intentional direction on that. The next instructional strategy that we could consider is modeling application of word recognition and really thinking about looking closely at words and how words are made up, thinking about affixes and suffixes, thinking about word parts and syllables. It's really important for us to be mindful of figuring out what it is that the kids are needing in their learning within reading and writing, and spend some attention and time thinking about those strategies of word recognition so that we become more automatic in recognizing words. Another strategy under this bullet would be building our knowledge about structures and features of text. And so when we think about structures, we can think about some fiction text. We can also think about nonfiction text. What do we know about the way the author has designed or structured this text? Maybe it's a compare contrast if we're looking at a nonfiction text. Maybe there's a problem solution if it's a fiction text. So we need to be mindful about being intentional in teaching those structures within text, but then also thinking about features of text. What do we notice about what the author included in this book? Maybe there are some graphics or diagrams. Maybe there are captions. Maybe there are photographs. These are things that we want to be very explicit about in our teaching. We also consider comprehension strategies when we think about read-alouds, really activating prior knowledge, having an opportunity for predictions and questioning, that wondering that goes along as the story is being read, putting pictures in your mind as you hear the words, and connecting that to what it is that you know about the situation or experience. How does it connect with you? Offering opportunities for sharing, how do we monitor and fix up? Often that happens during our think aloud when we're reading aloud as well. And then let's consider drawing inferences and summarizing and retelling. All of these strategies really help to build a reader and get them more comfortable when they get into their own book for independent work time. One last instructional strategy that's encountered in the Read Aloud bullet is the one on vocabulary. So it really meshes well with the one that was mentioned prior. When we think about really building on children's understanding of what words mean and really seeing what we can do with expanding vocabulary. I'm thinking about the different content areas. I loved how Mary Lou mentioned an opportunity of doing read-alouds during science and social studies. We don't want to miss those beautiful opportunities to fill our classrooms, even in a remote space, with very rich vocabulary. So again, as we mentioned to you, all of these different bullets and nuances within this essential number 2, it's amazing to think about what's in here. So to do a 1-hour webinar is a little bit tricky, but we did want to get some feedback from you. So what we'd like to do is to ask you just to reflect for a few moments as you consider read-alouds in your classroom. And as you consider thinking about what that read-aloud might have looked like in the spring as we were sent to our homes to finish our school year out. And then consider thinking about all the professional learning that's happened as you were engaged in teaching these children at the end of the school year. And then as you prepare for this coming school year, what are some successes that you have had around virtual read-alouds? So we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. And you can simply take a picture of this QR code on the screen and it will show up on your phone. And it'll take you to menti.com where you can answer this question. And Mary Lou will be able to populate a lot of the different answers so we can hear and see some of the things that you are finding successful in a read-aloud during a virtual setting.
Colleen, I believe that Laura also dropped in the chat.
So we're starting to get a couple of responses here. We're always trying to find a way to be interactive, even through a webinar series, but we think it's so important to hear your voices. You're in the trenches and really working through this, and we need to hear from you what is working best. So we've got people that are thinking about, we are seeing people thinking about read-alouds via Zoom and just asking questions and talking through a story. That's a great way. I've gotten to see many examples of people just trying that out and getting comfortable on the screen with just holding up a picture book and reading aloud to children. That's certainly one way that we can tackle that and also give kids an opportunity to talk about the book. A nice idea is using props from the child's environment. Maybe you're going to read about frogs today. Do you have a stuffed animal? Do you have a stuffed animal frog in your house? Do you want to prop it up next to you as we do our read aloud? Also really focusing in on the concepts of print and thinking about multiple meanings of words and talking through that with children. Thank you for that. Even talking about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, the different genres that kids are exposed to. Lots of patterns and rhymes, exposing them to lots of vocabulary and nuances of words. Posting a read aloud and having the audio available for future hearing, future listenings. What a great idea. Using real materials, again, real resources about how they've connected to that book. And then also placing some read alouds on YouTube. Students love being read to. Again and again, we know that. Thank you so much for your feedback. We appreciate you sharing the successes that have happened within your virtual space. And we continue to practice and think through that with you. Okay. Mary Lou is going to show us a document here that's called, it's titled Read Aloud Planning Template. And what we wanted to do is share this with you. You actually have access to the same template in the chat as well. You will have to make a copy of it prior to creating your own. But the reason we wanted to share this with you is because we know Read Aloud is so complex. There are so many things that we can focus on in a one session of a Read Aloud. This is a nice way to consider Read Alouds and really think about it bullet by bullet. If you know you want your focus to be on vocabulary today, you could take this planning template and really plan out those words that you wanted to share with the students and the definitions or child-friendly explanations that go along with it. You might even consider tools to help build on that vocabulary. Maybe you have a video you want to show. Maybe you want to do some movement or expression within your face. Maybe you're sharing structures and features of text, and you really want to hone in on certain things that you've been working on during a nonfiction unit of study. These are ways that you can really incorporate all the planning that goes along with a Read Aloud. We also wanted to mention to you how important it is to have mentor texts that you go back to and revisit again and again. So we consider a mentor text being some of those favorite loved books that have wonderful opportunities for kids to learn from in multiple settings. So if you filled out a planning sheet like this, you would see that you could go back into that Read Aloud and you would have numerous mini lessons that you could touch upon as you consider that Read Aloud for different settings. So we just wanted to offer that to you as a space for planning and as you consider Read Alouds in this virtual setting.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm going to take over again, and we'd like to do a little bit of a slowdown and focus on a few things. The first thing we want to focus in on essential too is that first bullet. Having an availability of texts and across different experiences and topics, and sometimes that can be a challenge. In our classrooms, we have those books and we're able to hold them up and we can share those with our students. We might put them under a projector, but in a remote learning environment, we don't have that option. So how do we have exposure to these texts in a way that our kids can see them? And we have a variety of them. And we had the pleasure, Colleen and I have had the pleasure of recently attending a session by Michigan E-Library. And we had this delightful lady, her name was Anne, and she took us through mel.org. And we were so impressed with the resources available at this site that we created a tutorial that we would like to share with you. And it really does walk you through the possibility of these resources and how you can then incorporate them into your remote environment. So we're going to let you go ahead and watch this video. We are also going to drop the link for this video in the chat. So let's just take a moment and watch. Hello, this quick video will help you navigate mel.org to find ebook resources for your students. Let's get started. First, put in your search bar mel.org, and this will take you to the Michigan E-Library welcome page. Then you're going to access e-resources. Scroll down and select K-12 schools. Because I'm working with elementary students, I'm then going to select K-5. And because I'd like access to e-books, I'm going to use the alphabet bar and I'm going to select E for ebooks. I'm going to scroll down and sure enough, there's my ebook K-8 collection. I'm going to select that. And then I'm given an option. I can use my search bar. I can browse by category. They give me some highlights and some featured ebooks. I'm going to go ahead and use the search bar because I'm looking for books on otters. And what you can see is they populated their selections on otters. There's some nonfiction text here. There's some juvenile fiction. We have quite the selection. I happen to be looking for this title, Little Otter Learns to Swim. So I'm going to select that title. And this page takes me to a description, the authors, publication date. But over here on the left, you'll notice that it has some options for downloading. You can view it as a PDF full text or a full download. You can also break down the contents of the book. I could go to the table of content and look at the cover, the start, or the copyright page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the full text. But before I do that, I don't want to forget to mention, on the right-hand side, you have a lot of options, tools for accessing this book. I can put it right into my Google Classroom. I can load it in my Google Drive, add it to a folder. I can even print it or save it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to select full text. Now that I'm here, I want to go down here in the right-hand corner. You'll see the 4 arrows. And when I hover over that, it says full screen view. I want to click on that. And then I'm going to go over one more time to the left. You can't see this button, but it looks like a piece of paper with a folded over edge. And if I hover over that, it says fit the page. Now I'm ready to read aloud to my students, and I can navigate the book as if it was right there in my lap. I can make the pages smaller to show them the pages that are coming up, or I can make them bigger to fill the screen. When I want to get out, I go again to the standard view, the arrows, the 4 in the corner. I click it and it brings me back to my original page. I hope this was helpful. So with this resource, you have a capability of taking these wonderful resources and putting them right into your learning management tool. I also had access to save these pages, particular pages, when I was working with nonfiction, and you'll see that later in our presentation. So at this time, I'd like to pause and say, Laura, are there any questions that we need to answer?
We did have a couple of questions in the Q&A section. So Karen asked about using a laser or a highlighter to bring emphasis to specific parts of print for virtual read-alouds. She wondered what was your advice on that?
This is what a great question, because Colleen and I were just talking about this. Colleen, could you jump in here and talk about the Chrome add-ons that you were experimenting with?
Sure. Actually, I was just kind of experimenting with those today as we were considering showing some text and thinking about print concepts and really focusing children's eyes on the text. And actually, I noticed there are multiple Chrome extensions that you can add on that have cute little cursors. In fact, one of them was called Cute Cursors, and they had a lovely little options of tools that you could use for a little highlighter. And that would be a really nice thing, just as a little game almost, if you were going to say, hey, let's see what cursor we have today for our read aloud. So I did have an opportunity to look through that. I was actually trying to really interact with mel.org because that was the example we were showing you. So I was having a little difficulty with that. But I know within other learning management systems, they do have some opportunities for highlighting text. So depending on what your district is using, you'll be able to find some different resources in that respect.
And please, we do invite you to drop any of your suggestions into the chat so we can all benefit from your experience. Okay.
And another question was,
go ahead.
Sorry, does mel.org have a pre-K section of books? I did look briefly for that answer, and it looks like there are some that are for the pre-K readers. So I didn't investigate it very much, but they are available.
Thank you, Laura. And you said there was one more question?
I think possibly the question Kelly asked about trying to hold the book, but the kids couldn't see it, would be solved with what you just showed them. The opportunity to have the book itself visible while you read it aloud to the kids. So then you wouldn't have to figure out how to hold the book up during a Zoom session.
And this is a great way to transition into our next section. So I'm going to turn it over to Colleen, and we're going to demonstrate how this would look and sound in a remote environment. So Colleen?
Thank you, Mary Lou. So let's talk about print concepts for a moment. We know we have to have kids' eyes on text for them to learn and understand how print actually works. In fact, I recall hearing Dr. Nell Duke and Dr. Tanya Wright sharing some interesting research. They were able to actually check in on young children's eyes to see where they were focused during a read aloud session. And they were saying that the findings were that when a teacher was very insistent upon using her motion of her hand moving across words or her finger or using a stick or something to keep children's eyes directed on the print, it showed that kids were more apt to look at the book and follow along than if you hadn't done that. So it's something so simple and small, and maybe it's something we don't even really think about. That's a great strategy, but it certainly is for kids to be able to see the text as you hold it up, and then for you to simply slide your fingers or a stick to run, to allow the children's eyes to run underneath the words and to see how print is formed and how we read from left to right and from top to bottom. And so actually Mary Lou is going to go ahead and open Mel.org to one of those books that we were just searching for, which is Otter Learns to Swim.
And I'm sorry, it's going to take me just a second, Colleen, because that was one thing I forgot to do before we came on.
That's all right.
Grant me the grace to get there quickly.
Yeah, it's very nice to get back into Mel.org and kind of look at those steps as she quickly locates the name of this title. And of course, Otter Learns to Swim is a fictional story. And when we think about showing our screen in a remote setting, it's really a nice idea to show the entire page on a screen. I think it's really helpful for kids to see that. There it is. And we can view the full text. And so if you simply play around, I actually did this afternoon. I played around with my mouse and cursor on my computer, and I can make my arrow actually become larger if I wanted to, or my cursor. But look at what Mary Lou's doing. She's slowly running her cursor around the words in a text so that we can keep our students' eyes focused onto the screen. And now just imagine if you had that Chrome extension, that might even be a neater way for the kids to kind of keep track and follow. The one that I was playing around with was a magic wand and a rabbit. But wouldn't it be neat to find something as simple as a star or something just to keep the kids' attention? So I was playing around with it, and you are able to download these texts from Mel.org onto your computer, or you can actually download them into Google Classroom. So if you do that, you'll have that opportunity to play around with that Chrome extension I mentioned earlier. So really important for kids to look at text. Even as you notice Mary Lou scrolling through that text, you see some text is at the bottom of the page. It's important to recognize that and talk to children about, oh, I don't see words at the top of the page. They're not even at the middle. They're at the bottom of the page. Where do I begin reading, readers? And so just to acknowledge that an author can place words in different areas of the page, but we always know we start at the top left and move towards the bottom in a left to right motion. So just some quick little tips there as far as print concepts.
Colleen, could I just ask, there's been some questions in the chat regarding the name of the Chrome extension that you were experimenting with.
Yes, thank you, Laura. The Chrome extension that I was playing with today was called Cute Cursors. So how cute is that name, right? And there's a variety of things you can choose from, but there were several that actually popped up, believe it or not. So go ahead and check those out and enjoy playing with those.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and do a little work around word recognition. And this time, instead of going into Mel.org, I've already downloaded some pages that I want to focus on, and I have incorporated them into my slide. So that is another benefit with Mel.org, is that you can actually isolate just a few pages if you're working with students. And we know with nonfiction text, many times there's chapters or sections. So what I've done is I've isolated the reading that we did the day before. The first read through, I read the entire book through over multiple days. And then we came back and we looked at some sections. The day before, we talked about what otters eat. And I introduced the lesson thinking about, what do you eat and what tools do you use? So we had some really great conversation around that. And then I took them into our interactive read aloud. And this is what it's kind of looked like. Boys and girls, do you remember we were talking about otters yesterday and we were talking about what they eat and the tools that they use? Well, today we're going to go ahead and we're going to read about their daily life. So here's the title, and look at how big that title is, and it's in red. Daily life. Here we go. Otters can dive 300 feet, 91 meters deep. They push themselves through the, oh, look at this. This is a word that ends in that ER pattern. We've been working on that. Do you remember that ER makes that sound? Say ER sound with me. Now, I'm not sure what this word is, so I'm going to look at the beginning sound. That letter is a W, and say that beginning sound with me. Wha. So let's stretch through the word. Water. Water, that makes sense with our otters. Let me go back. They push themselves through the water using their strong legs and tails. On land, otters can run up to 29 miles, 47 kilometers per hour. Most of their time is spent, this is a long word, but wait, I see a word we know already, water. Let's look at the front part of it. We know these two beginning sounds, don't we? U and N make the sound un, underwater. Most of their time is spent underwater, swimming through kelp and seaweed. Sea otters wrap themselves in kelp to help them stay afloat. That means floating on top of the water. They are able to eat, sleep, and play this way. Now at this point, I might raise kelp as an instructional point because it's a different color. But I want to be cautious not to have too many instructional goals with my interactive read aloud because then we lose meaning. So I have to be mindful when I'm planning to have specific and explicit instructional goals as not to overwhelm my students. We'd like to share with you right now a really quick clip of Essential 2, Bullet 5 video that you'll find in the modules. And what we'd like you to do is, as you watch this 2-minute snippet, the original video is over 12 minutes, we've just isolated this 2 minutes. And we'd like you to think about this question. How might the teacher move this lesson into a remote environment? As educators, we're always reflecting and revising our practice. And in our current situation of remote learning, how might strong instructional practices and student engagement look and sound with remote learning? So as you watch, be mindful of that.
Read-Alouds with kindergartners are usually no longer than 20 minutes. The more interactive they are, the more successful they are. So I typically like to start with introducing the book. I set the purpose for them. They typically repeat the purpose to me. And then I stop at different spots. And those are spots where I usually ask them an open-ended question or prompt them to turn and talk with each other about the strategy that we're working on. So in the book that I will be teaching for my Read Aloud, it has a compare and contrast text structure. It's an informational text called Biggest, Strongest, Fastest. And the author has written it in a way that he is comparing human facts or characteristics to animal characteristics. There's also an image in the corner that shows an animal being compared and contrasted to a human. What does this image tell you about what an ant is capable of carrying or what a human is capable of carrying?
Ants are a little bit stronger than humans because a human can weigh 1 human and an ant can weigh 5 ants.
So you see that an ant is capable of carrying 5 ants, so 5 times its own body weight, and a human is capable of carrying 1 time its own body weight or 1 human. Let's look at the giraffe. If you're looking at this picture, what are you learning about how giraffes are the same or different from humans?
Giraffe is taller than the human.
A giraffe is much taller than a human. This author, Steve Jenkins, he compared and contrasted humans to other animals in this book. How do you think comparing and contrasting humans to other animals helped you learn the information the author wanted you to learn in this book?
I told you how much stronger and bigger they were than the humans.
So you learned how much stronger an ant is than a human, or just how strong an ant is. You learned, your second one was how big an animal could be, like the blue whale. So comparing and contrasting humans to animals can help you really understand how big, how strong, how fast certain animals are.
So as I'm viewing this video as an educator, I'm thinking to myself, if I was face to face, I would definitely want to create an anchor chart for compare and contrast. And I then started to wonder, how would I make that happen in a virtual environment? So Colleen and I have been experimenting with some remote anchor charts. Share some things that we found around that. So what we found is with the Jamboard, if you are part of the Google Suite, a G Suite owner, you can use Jamboard, and we've got our colleague Laura is going to drop that into the chat for you, the link to Jamboard. And basically what this is it's an interactive whiteboard, and you share the link with your students, and then they can drag things around. I've used this to create Alconin boxes. It's just a real user-friendly type of whiteboard. Next, you could use a Zoom whiteboard if you're using Zoom to connect with your students. They have the capability of drawing on it and typing on it, or possibly Pear Deck, which is a free platform where you can create interactive lessons. A caution with that is the free is only with asynchronous learning, and we're not sure how long they're going to extend the free subscription for it. But again, we're going to drop that link in the chat. We invite you to go ahead and explore that. Recently, I have been experimenting with Pear Deck and creating some of the remote anchor charts. And I found that I can easily then put them into my learning management system, such as if I'm using Teams or if I'm using Google Classroom, I can embed those and put them in a place that is easy for me to find and easy for my students to use. Because in a remote environment, I don't have a wall to put up that anchor chart. I really have to be mindful of these materials and where I can use them. Another idea for our older students, you might consider Padlet. I don't have that on the screen, but I just thought of that today. With a Padlet, if you're doing a read aloud, you can invite your students to develop questions as you're reading and share them on Padlet. And then as a group, come back and have a meaningful conversation around their questions.
So as you consider some practices that you might embed in your virtual read-alouds, we'd love to hear from you. Thinking about maybe some things we shared today, thinking about some things you learned from the chat, and hearing from ideas about successes that happened in the spring. We'd like you to now consider thinking about what instructional practices will you embed in your virtual read-aloud. And so again, we're going to take you back into engagement to menti.com. And once again, Laura will place that menti.com link into the chat, or you can simply take a picture of the QR code on your phone. And again, that will invite you to a survey with this question: what instructional practices will you embed in your virtual read-alouds this fall? Okay, and then once again, we will see some responses being populated as you consider these instructional practices for a virtual read-aloud. So you'll start to see the population creating more of a word cloud this time, which is another nice feature of engaging students, but having a different way of looking at responses. And you know, word clouds are created, and when we see a font that's a little bit larger or a word that's being used again and again, we notice that it's bigger because more people are mentioning or responding that same way. So we see some different things that people would like to try out or maybe have had successes with. Certainly we see people saying they like Mel and using that Zoom whiteboard as a feature possibly. Maybe trying this Mentimeter as an opportunity for engagement during a read aloud. Really tying into vocabulary and thinking about writing and sharing ideas from a read aloud, using cue cursors. Lots of different ideas. So thank you so much for sharing those ideas as you consider some practices, some best practices that we still never want to veer away from, but think about how we might tweak it in this virtual setting this year. So we would also like to invite you to offer some feedback to us. What kinds of things were you able to take away with you during this 1 hour of learning and maybe try out in your classroom? We'd like to hear your feedback because we would like to continue on with offering these webinars. And we noticed that today's topic was highly popular. So if we need to dive into more of Read-Alouds, we certainly can. We were able to highlight a couple of bullets within Essential Number 2, but certainly not all. So your feedback is highly important to us, and it really gears us to what we can do for you as you continue on with your school year. And then lastly, we would like to thank you for joining us today. Mary Lou?
And just again, to echo what Colleen just indicated, we want to thank you for your attention and your insight in the chat.